One of the things we talked a lot about over the last few days is this concept of geroscience. And that geroscience is that field of research that's studying how aging drives disease, all the chronic conditions we associate with older age. And then the question is, what can you do about it? And so it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. John Newman back to the stage. John is at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, and he's going to be talking about the future of translational geroscience. How do we take some of the concepts and things that we know and understand, and how do we begin to apply them to real-world solutions? And so please join me in welcoming Dr. John Newman.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank all of you who are here for the first time today. Welcome. I hope this is going to be a very productive and interesting day of learning for you, and welcome back to those of you for whom this is day 3. As Brian said, I'm a geriatrician. I'm a doctor who specializes in older adults. I know many of you in the audience are clinicians. But I'm also a basic scientist, and I'm also a clinical researcher. And my career has been devoted to figuring out how we can take the exciting biology of aging, science of why and how we age, and turn it into therapies that can change the lives of the older patients, all the patients that we care for. And the next 30 minutes is going to be a glimpse into how this happens and how we're doing it at the Buck Institute, how we're taking science out of the laboratory and figuring out how to test it in real-world clinical applications, and how we're helping to accelerate this whole field to provide training and educational materials for researchers and scientists who want to do something similar. I have several disclosures, companies I've been involved with as a scientific co-founder. One of them will be relevant, the component health relationship, which I'll mention when we talk about our clinical trials in a few minutes. For those of you for whom this is your first day at the meeting, I want to just briefly summarize some of the key points that you all have been learning over the last 3 days. And if you remember nothing else from this meeting, I hope you remember these really critical points about aging and disease and the hope for the research on aging to change the lives of billions of people around the world. We all understand on some level that aging is the primary risk factor, the primary driver of most of the chronic diseases that most affect our patients' lives, and that we as doctors and nurses spend most of our time treating, everything from Alzheimer's disease to atherosclerosis. But I learned in medical school that aging is non-modifiable, and so didn't learn any more about it. But I want you guys to understand that aging is not a number. The fact that people accumulate these chronic diseases as we get older isn't because time slowly passes since they were born, but rather it's because aging is biology. And we understand that biology. We now understand the cellular and molecular mechanisms that drive the effects of aging on health, that drive this relationship between aging and disease. We can understand these mechanisms, we can study them in the laboratory, and increasingly we can manipulate them. This leads to the geroscience hypothesis, the rainbow at the end of this science, that interventions that target fundamental mechanisms of aging that are at the root of all of these different chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease. If we target those fundamental mechanisms of aging with gerotherapeutics, we will prevent, mitigate, or treat, delay multiple diseases of aging simultaneously. And this can be a strategy, a way out of the increasing problem of an aging population accumulating more and more chronic disease, leading to disability independence. Translational geroscience is how we get from here to there. And I'll give you a vignette about how we're doing translational geroscience to move discoveries out of my own laboratory, and about the current state of translational geroscience. This sounds like science fiction, but it is very real. Let's dive into a little bit of basic science. My laboratory studies ketone bodies as one of the mechanisms that regulate aging. Many of you may have heard of ketone bodies, especially if you're a diabetologist. We're not talking about diabetic ketoacidosis here, but we're talking about how your bodies naturally make ketone bodies all the time. These are small molecules made in your liver, mostly from fats mobilized out of adipose tissue, that help us to survive a fast, or survive when we're starving. They provide energy to muscles, the heart, the brain, when there's not enough glucose around. Now, those of you who are here the past 2 days learned a lot about how fasting and caloric restriction and nutrition and exercise are very foundational to regulating mechanisms of aging. And in these circumstances, like fasting and caloric restriction, your body makes more ketone bodies. So for a long time, this was thought to just be a coincidence. You're fasting, you have to make ketone bodies to survive that. But in the last 15 years or so, my group and a number of others around the world have learned that actually ketone bodies have important biological functions that interact with mechanisms of aging and provide some of the health effects of fasting and dietary restriction. And some examples of these are how ketone bodies provide energy to cells in lieu of glucose. As we get older, we have a harder time metabolizing glucose for energy. This is a feature of Alzheimer's disease, for example, and ketone bodies can help to compensate for that deficit in energy production. But ketone bodies also act like drugs within the body. They bind to proteins, they activate receptors, and thereby they regulate a number of the other cellular and molecular mechanisms of aging, from stem cell function to epigenetics and more. My laboratory has done a lot of foundational basic science on working out what these molecular mechanisms are that ketone bodies activate. Just recently, for example, we published some work showing that ketone bodies can bind to misfolded proteins in the brain, toxic misfolded proteins like A beta, and actually assist with the clearance of those proteins from a brain, from a mouse brain. Hold that thought for a moment. And we've learned a bunch about how ketone bodies activate mechanisms within neurons, within synapses, to make synapses healthier and more youthful as mice age. Through all this work, we've learned that ketone bodies interact with most of these hallmarks of aging that you've seen, most of the mechanisms of aging. So this is all very exciting if you're a mouse. It may be a little bit less exciting if you're a person, because all of this work is done in mice. And often this work is done in worms and yeast and flies. You've learned a little bit about how this basic science has been revealed about the biology of aging. But we want to change people's lives. We don't just want to make mice healthier. So how do we move these discoveries out of the laboratory and apply them to human health? As a geriatrician, my particular interest is in treating the complex geriatric syndromes, things like frailty. Frailty, as many of you know if you interact with older adults, is the concept of you know when someone is old when you see them. Old in the sense of you're worried they're going to fall. You're worried if you do surgery on them, it's not going to go well. You're worried if they get the flu, they're going to do very poorly. Frailty is this systemic state of vulnerability, reduced reserve. It's associated with a very high mortality risk. Also, interestingly, a very high dementia risk. The brain and the body are deeply interconnected, and a high risk of disability. Frailty doesn't have any drug therapies. The best therapies for frailty are exercise. This is because the biology of frailty is so complicated. What we think we know about it is it involves dysfunctional energy production, poor glucose metabolism. It involves dysfunctional chronic inflammation, and it involves loss of muscle mass. Now, it so happens that these are all things that in the laboratory, in mice, ketone bodies have been shown to interact with. But what we don't know is whether ketone bodies do these things in people, and whether that would affect frailty and the frailty phenotype. Doing that first step of, does this biology that we've worked out in mice actually help people? This first step has been identified as the key barrier in translating exciting biology of aging into human applications. That very first step, the first small clinical trials to prove mechanism in people. And I was fortunate enough to be involved about 10 years ago in an international group of scientists and clinicians and clinical researchers who want to bring aging biology into clinical practice faster, who tried to figure out what are the barriers? Why can't we do this faster? And the key thing identified was early stage clinical research to prove concepts and test if things are relevant to people. And investigators who have the unique set of skills to do this kind of clinical research. what do these early stage clinical trials look like? They involve, they're often small, they involve de-risking studies, making sure that what you're using is safe, is tolerable, testing kinetics in older adults, validating mechanisms, the examples I used in mice. Do ketone bodies, for example, does the biology work the same way in people as it does in mice? And generating signals of efficacy. Are the biological functions, the molecular functions doing what you expect? Do you see signals that you're improving people clinically? And then you can move on to bigger trials that will change practice. This is all familiar probably from the way that new drugs get developed. These are phase 1, early phase 2 studies, but they're also really important for applying dietary supplements, applying food products, repurposing drugs like metformin for new applications, early stage clinical trials. So we had to do this with ketone bodies. We couldn't just give ketone bodies to people with frailty. There really wasn't enough data to support that kind of clinical study. In the literature, the longest study ever done of giving ketone bodies to people was only 28 days, and that was in young people. Almost nothing with older people, nothing at all with frail people, and nothing at all about whether these mechanisms that we've worked out in mice about inflammation and muscle catabolism, whether that was relevant to people. So we had to do this ourselves first. First, though, we needed a molecule that we could give to people to give them ketone bodies. This we co-developed with an industry partner, Component Health, to create a molecule that one can consume, one can drink essentially, and is very rapidly metabolized in the body to generate ketone bodies. So this is a way of giving someone ketone bodies without fasting, without starvation, and without a ketogenic diet. They just directly consume essentially ketone bodies. All of this work was done in collaboration with Dr. Brianna Stubbs, who's a research assistant professor at the Buck Institute and co-directs all of our clinical research enterprise at the Buck Institute. So we ran a pilot early stage proof of concept clinical trial with the ketone ester in older adults. It was small, it was only about 30 people. It was healthy older adults, reasonably normal older adults, normal sets of chronic diseases, normal sets of medications, but stable health. And they were living independently in the community. Half of them took the ketone ester, half of them took a placebo. But we had some very specific goals in mind for this proof of concept study. We weren't trying to cure their frailty, we were trying to see, does this work the way we expect, so that we can run a larger study. So we want to make sure that ketone bodies generated the same kinetics that we were expecting. We wanted to specifically test safety and tolerability in older people, which had never been done before. We wanted to look for markers that the biological mechanisms were working the same, that we were on the right track in trying to treat frailty with this compound. And look for a signal if we could change function. Because we did test not just biology in these participants, but we tested their gait speed and their strength, their cognitive function, and things like that too. The pilot study was a success. We showed that the kinetics actually were a little bit different in older people. They usually are, but not so much that we had to change how we designed a larger study. Importantly, we showed that it was safe and tolerable, similar to a placebo. And also, really importantly, we did indeed see signals that these biological mechanisms that had only been worked out in mice previously do seem to actually be happening in people too. That was really reassuring and led us to think that we should do this in a larger way, and we should actually try to test if ketone bodies could help improve function in frailty. So that's what we're doing now in a study called Takeoff, targeting aging with a ketone ester for function in frailty. Now that we had all that data from our first pilot clinical trial, we could move on to a larger, multi-center, nationally funded clinical trial with collaborators across the US, and again, co-led by my colleague, Dr. Brianna Stubbs, enrolling pre-frail and frail older adults, having them take the ketone ester for about 5 months, and testing whether it improves their function, their strength, their endurance, their cognitive performance, along with a deep dive into the biology. So we can both see how it's working and how well it's working to improve people's lives. That sort of transition from molecules to mice to early data from people into clinical trials that might change people's lives, that's the sort of transition that we now have national networks in the United States to help support. The Translational Geroscience Network is a multi-institution national network to support exactly these kinds of early stage clinical trials to bring aging biology out of the laboratory and apply it especially to the problems of older adults. And then a sister network, the Geroscience Education and Training Network, whose goal is to train investigators to do these sorts of clinical trials. And I'll talk more about that in a second because I helped to lead it. The future of geroscience is actually here, and we are helping to build it here at the Buck Institute. This is where our research laboratories are. This is where our clinical research unit is. There are other places like this around the world that you've heard about, in Singapore, in Los Angeles, in other places in Europe. This is ours. We've built an integrated basic science, bench-to-bedside clinical research team at the Buck Institute, so we can not just do science with flies and with worms and with mice, but we can actually directly test ideas, mechanisms, and outcomes in people too. One thing I've learned is how important people are in creating a high-level research program. The most important resource that we have to do clinical research at the Buck Institute are our people. It's not about fancy, expensive machines. We really don't have any. It's about skilled, talented people who are trained to work with older adults and interact with basic scientists. This is our wonderful multidisciplinary, multicultural team of doctors and scientists and research associates and nurses and so forth. The sorts of studies that we do are meant to link biology to clinical application. So we do basic experimental studies in humans. I'll give you an example of that. Testing the biology of aging in people rather than in mice. We also do early stage kind of first steps into human biology clinical trials of the sort I just talked about with ketone bodies. And we serve as a node for larger multi-center clinical trials to hopefully do practice-changing trials that will really change the way that we approach the care of older adults, not just things like frailty, but the care of older adults in general. One of the studies I want to share with you that we're doing that falls into the realm of basic science with humans, but I think you might be surprised how we're doing it, is a set of studies designed to investigate how different environments in which people live, different life experiences, affect the biology of their aging. We know that wealth is one of the most powerful determinants of healthy aging. In a place like the United States, the differences in life expectancy between poor communities and rich communities is still quite large. We want to understand what are the molecular mechanisms that drive how these social drivers of health, socioeconomic factors, physical environment, health behaviors like smoking and diet, and especially exercise, how these things work through biology to change aging outcomes, to affect the risk of chronic disease. So on the one hand, we're looking at older adults who have been high-level athletes their whole lives and who still are, who are over 65 and are competing at world championship levels, who are very well-trained athletes and of course are very well off in other areas of their life too. We want to know what's special about them in their biology and also what's not special about them in their biology. On the other hand, I can't think of a more extreme opposite, a more extreme version of deprivation in social drivers of health than people experiencing homelessness. And if you watch the news, you probably know that there are a fair number of people experiencing homelessness in California, in San Francisco where I live, and in Los Angeles. So we're collaborating with people in Los Angeles to plan a research study of involving people who are experiencing homelessness to study the state of their aging. The state of their aging clinically. We know that they're at much higher risk for age-related diseases at a much younger age, but trying to quantify that physiologically, and also molecularly. Are they aging faster in these cellular and molecular pathways in a mirror image of how someone who is a well-off elite athlete may be aging slower? And will this help guide us on what's most important to intervene on, and also what are the most important molecular factors that drive aging across the spectrum of social drivers of health among people? One of the other studies that we're doing that you'll hear Dr. Yurkovich talk about in much more detail is more of a how to bring technology to the masses kind of study. How to take technology, high-dimensional multi-omic studies that we do in the laboratory, but really haven't found any clinical application yet, but how to gather the data we need to actually understand how to use these data to be more precise about measuring people's aging and guiding their health in a personalized way. And Dr. Yurkovich will talk much more about this complex time study a little bit later today. So we are a clinical research center that specializes in geroscience, is closely linked to basic science laboratories, but we're also expert in older adults, and we're grounded in solving the problems of older adults. We're skilled in how to assess aging in older adults functionally, and really importantly to me, we are deeply engaged with our entire local community in the San Francisco Bay Area. You heard me say this on Thursday if you were here. We all age. Aging affects every single human being if we are so lucky. And who should be involved in aging research? Everybody. Who is aging research for? Everybody. And who is aging research most likely to benefit? Well, like I just talked about with people experiencing homelessness, I think it's most likely to benefit most those people who have deprivations in these social drivers of health that drive aging. We need more investigators to do studies like this. So I want to finish up by talking with you about education and training programs that I'm involved in that may be relevant to you or to your students and trainees. So these are products of the Geroscience Education and Training Network, which is currently a collaboration with the Gerontological Society of America. On the one hand, most medical students, well, to be perfectly honest, most medical students don't learn very much about aging or geriatrics at all. I hope that we can change that around the world. Medical students certainly don't learn about the biological basis of aging. So we're hoping to change that, to provide a foundational introduction to medical students, to PhD students around the country, around the United States, and around the world, to introduce them to concepts of aging and aging research, why aging is important clinically, why aging is a topic for research, and how aging is driven by biology. So this involves creating curricular materials, slide decks and recorded lectures, writing chapters in standard geriatric medicine textbooks, and creating catchy shareables for social media, all to help teach young learners, students, that this is a field of interest, to give them a basic introduction. And all of these materials, in particular the curricular materials, will be available publicly to the entire world. And that's the whole idea, so that a medical school that doesn't have someone like me can still give a lecture or introduce students to the concepts of aging research, and geroscience. Then we also need investigators, scientists, clinician researchers, people like some of you, who can run these clinical trials. So the other thing we're developing are materials to teach early stage investigators who are learning how to do clinical research, to teach them how to do geroscience clinical research. In the form of a certificate or a master's degree in translational geroscience. The idea here is that it's pretty common at my university for doctors or postdoctoral fellows to take a course in how to do clinical research. We want them to do that, we want them to enroll in that, but there are no centers in the United States that can then teach them how to do geroscience clinical research. So we're creating the courses for them to do that. We're creating courses in the biology of aging, how it applies to clinical research. We're creating a course in geriatric medicine principles relevant to geroscience research, and a course in how to do research with older adults. These last two courses, by the way, the course about geriatric medicine principles, we actually couldn't find anywhere in the United States an online class that summarized basic geriatric medicine principles relevant to clinical practice. So we created it. Even if you're not planning to do geroscience clinical research, that may be very interesting and valuable for medical students, internal medicine residents, nurses to see and use. So we're creating these 3 12-hour courses. Each one has 12 topics. These are examples of topics in the geriatric medicine course and topics in the biological mechanisms of aging course. Each one of these topics has about an hour's worth of content. recorded mini lectures, usually 2 or 3 per topic, plus materials for further reading and examples for case discussions. All of these materials are going to be posted online and available for people to use. And the whole idea of this course, I'll tell you a little bit more about the lectures. So all these mini lectures are done by world-leading experts in the field, mostly but not entirely in the United States. And they give a kind of foundational dive into each of these topics. What does someone need to know so that they can learn more? Just give them the basic outline of each topic and prepare them for future learning. The idea behind this is that we're creating the materials so that other people at other institutions can create a certificate program themselves based on whatever the requirements are at their local institution. So we provide the course materials. You can provide it to your trainees and your students and thereby create a training program in clinical research related to geroscience. So through these things, I'll skip over the last couple of slides. This is a very exciting time for geroscience, the biology of aging, to be coming into clinical practice relevance. We're growing the field of geroscience investigators through training programs that we're developing and others too around the world that you've heard about in the last 3 days. There's a growing global network of centers that are doing early stage clinical trials and serving as nodes for larger multi-center studies to figure out how geroscience interventions, whether they're repurposed drugs or other interventions, can change clinical practice. And a growing network of partners, national clinical trial networks, global clinical trial networks to accelerate all of this towards clinical application. All of this work takes a very large team. I again want to give a particular shout out to my partner and co-director, Brianna Stubbs, along with all of the physicians and scientists and staff who are helping to carry out all these clinical studies and our funding, mostly from the US government, but also from foundations and philanthropists. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. You know, one of the things you're talking about, just maybe speak real quickly about the future promise of where does geroscience go after clinical studies? What's the promise of geroscience down the road?
The promise is that geroscience is going to become a very boring part of medicine that's just deeply integrated into everything that we do. And I like analogies of how do we approach cardiovascular disease? Well, you identify risk factors in young people, like blood pressure. You start treating them in young people. We'd give blood pressure medicines to people in their 30s, and that helps to prevent problems down the line. When people develop problems like heart attacks, we have medicines to help them recover from them and help prevent it from happening again. Geroscience interventions, gerotherapeutic drugs will be used in the same way. There'll be specific biomarkers and indications and risk factors that we can use to help treat people earlier in life to prevent problems. There'll be other drugs that are used to help to prevent the recurrence of problems when someone already has a couple of major chronic diseases to keep them healthier and more functional. And there'll be other drugs that can be used to help recover from serious health stresses in the way that younger people can. And I think all of this, the first drug indications coming from geroscience, I think will happen within the next 5 years. I'm pretty sure about that.
That's true.
And that whole ecosystem, I think, will be a part of medicine before you know it.
One last quick question. It's sort of related. We've got a couple questions around ketones and fasting, and one of the questions was, until ketone esters become available, how might you recommend or approach either intermittent fasting or fasting, and are ketone esters available?
Yeah, ketone esters and other compounds we call them exogenous ketones, ketone bodies that you can eat or drink or consume, are widely available. They're considered generally food products, nutritional supplements. I think it's important to study their biology and determine exactly how they can be useful clinically, but they are available out there commercially. And fasting is an interesting question because production of ketone bodies, endogenous ketone bodies, is probably part of the health benefits of fasting. It's very variable person to person. The longer you fast, the more ketone bodies you make. It's hard to tell how long do you need to fast is a hard question to answer for an individual, but it probably is part of the biology that is being expressed when you fast. And there are clinical trials, randomized controlled trials happening of fasting regimens to, for example, help people prepare for chemotherapy. as prehabilitation based on activating mechanisms of aging that will make someone more resilient to the stresses of chemotherapy or surgery, things like that.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Terrific.
Thanks, everyone.